Right now, as you listen to music on your car radio, as you stream a crystal-clear signal through an FM transmitter, as you hear a voice cut through the air without a single crackle or pop of static, you are living inside the life's work of a man whose name you almost certainly do not know. His invention is in billions of devices. It shaped the soundtrack of the 20th century. It made radio something worth listening to. And the man who built it from nothing, who climbed to rooftops in the dead of winter to prove it worked, who mortgaged his own life to fight for it, that man put on his overcoat on a January night in 1954, opened the window of his 13th floor apartment, and stepped out into the dark. His name was Edwin Howard Armstrong, and this is the story of how the world took everything he gave it and gave him nothing back. Edwin Armstrong was born in New York City in 1890 into a family that valued education and rewarded curiosity. From the time he was a child, he was consumed by radio, not as a hobby, not as a pastime, as an obsession that bordered on the religious. While other boys played in the streets of Yonkers, Armstrong built antennas on the roof of his family's house. He read every technical paper he could find. He taught himself the mathematics of electromagnetic waves before most adults in his neighborhood could have explained what an electromagnetic wave was. There was a quality to his thinking that his professors at Columbia University would later struggle to describe, a kind of fearless intuition, the ability to see not just how a thing worked, but how it could be made to work better, and then to go build it alone, without waiting for permission or funding or approval from anyone. By the time he was 22 years old, he had already done something that electrical engineers twice his age had failed to do. He had invented the regenerative circuit, a feedback system that took a weak radio signal and amplified it dramatically, making long-distance radio reception possible in a practical way. He invented it in his parents' attic in 1912. He was a junior in college. It would become one of the foundational technologies of modern communication, and it would also become the first of several inventions that Armstrong would spend years of his life defending in court against men who claimed to have invented it first. That fight against Lee DeForest dragged on for decades. It was bitter, it was exhausting, and in some ways it was a rehearsal for what was coming. But through all of it, Armstrong kept inventing. In 1918, while serving as a signal officer for the U.S. Army in France, he invented the superheterodyne circuit, the architecture that virtually every radio receiver in the world still uses today. He came home from the war decorated and celebrated, and he turned around and invented the supergenerative circuit on top of that. By the late 1920s, Edwin Armstrong held patents that sat at the very foundation of radio as an industry. He was, by any honest accounting, one of the most important inventors in the history of electronic communication. And he was about to do it again. Here is what you need to understand about radio in the early 1930s. Radio was already a mass medium. Millions of Americans owned receivers. Stations broadcast news, music, drama, comedy, but every transmission was delivered on AM amplitude modulation, and AM radio had a fundamental, inescapable problem: static, electrical interference. Thunderstorms, power lines, the ignition systems of automobiles, all of it contaminated the signal. A beautiful piece of music could dissolve into a wall of noise without warning. Engineers had tried for years to solve the static problem. The conventional wisdom, stated plainly by some of the most respected scientists in the field, was that static was not solvable. It was a property of the physics. You could reduce it slightly, you could manage it, but you could not eliminate it. Edwin Armstrong disagreed. FM frequency modulation was not a new concept in the early 1930s. The principle had been theorized for decades, but the consensus view, held by experts including an influential analysis published by John Carson at Bell Labs in 1922, was that FM would actually produce more bandwidth use than AM for no meaningful benefit. FM was considered a dead end. The math, as most people did the math, seemed to confirm it. Armstrong did the math differently. He didn't just theorize, he built. Working in a Columbia University laboratory, across years of meticulous, grinding experimental work, he developed a wideband FM system that did something that was supposed to be impossible. It eliminated static almost entirely. not reduced it, eliminated it. The clarity of an FM signal, as Armstrong demonstrated it, was so startling that people who heard it for the first time didn't trust their ears. When he first played a demonstration for a room of engineers in 1935, he didn't just pipe through a radio signal. He poured a glass of water in front of the microphone so they could hear the sound of liquid splashing with crystalline, perfect fidelity. He crinkled paper. He played a piano. Every sound came through as though the performer was standing in the room. The static was gone. What Armstrong had understood, and what his critics had missed, was that by using a much wider band of the frequency spectrum, by spreading the signal out rather than compressing it, you could encode information in the frequency of the wave rather than its amplitude, and in doing so, you could make the signal essentially immune to the amplitude-based interference that created static. It was counterintuitive. It required more spectrum space per channel, which was why Carson and others had dismissed it. But Armstrong saw that the trade-off was not just acceptable, it was transformative. FM didn't just make radio clearer, it made radio faithful. For the first time in history, music could be broadcast and received with something approaching the full richness of how it actually sounded. He had solved the unsolvable problem. And the man he brought this discovery to, the man he trusted with it more than anyone else in the world, was his closest friend in the radio industry, a man named David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff was, by 1933, one of the most powerful figures in American media. He ran RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, which at that point was essentially the center of gravity of the entire broadcast industry. Sarnoff and Armstrong had known each other for years. Armstrong had sold RCA the rights to his superheterodyne patents for $400,000 and 100 shares of RCA stock, a transaction that made Armstrong wealthy and made RCA's dominance possible. They were friends. Armstrong trusted him. When Armstrong demonstrated FM to Sarnoff at the Empire State Building in 1933, Sarnoff reportedly told him it was the most remarkable thing he had ever heard. And then RCA began to understand what FM would actually mean for their business. Here is what FM threatened. RCA had spent enormous sums building an AM broadcast infrastructure across the country. They held valuable AM patents. AM receivers were in millions of homes. AM broadcasting was the foundation of NBC, which RCA owned. A widespread shift to FM would not just improve radio, it would render much of RCA's existing investment obsolete. It would require new transmitters, new receivers, new infrastructure. And perhaps more importantly, FM required a different allocation of the radio spectrum, which would mean dealing with regulators, reconfiguring the existing broadcast map, and disrupting an arrangement that RCA had spent years engineering to its own advantage. FM wasn't just a better technology. To RCA, FM was a threat. What followed was not a sudden, dramatic betrayal. It was slower than that, and in some ways more insidious. Sarnoff gave Armstrong laboratory space at the Empire State Building to conduct his early FM experiments, and then used the access that gave RCA engineers to study the technology. RCA initially appeared to be a potential partner. Armstrong applied for and received his core FM patents in 1933. He demonstrated the system publicly. He built his own FM station in Alpine, New Jersey, spending a significant portion of his personal fortune to do it, and began broadcasting in 1939. Early FM receivers came to market. The technology worked, and it worked magnificently. But RCA began to lobby the Federal Communications Commission. They pushed for spectrum allocations that would limit FM's potential. In 1945, in a regulatory decision that benefited AM broadcasters and RCA's television ambitions, television being the next great medium, Sarnoff was racing to dominate. The FCC shifted FM broadcasting to a different part of the spectrum. This single decision made every FM receiver and every FM transmitter that had been sold and built up to that point obsolete overnight. Hundreds of FM stations, millions of dollars in equipment, all of it rendered worthless by a regulatory stroke that Armstrong and others believed was engineered in part by RCA's influence on the process. Then came the patent litigation. RCA began manufacturing FM receivers and equipment without paying Armstrong the royalties he was legally entitled to under his patents. Their legal argument was that Armstrong's FM patents were either invalid or that RCA had independently developed the relevant technologies. Armstrong sued. RCA, with its vast legal resources and its ability to extend proceedings indefinitely, made the litigation a war of attrition. One by one, other companies that had been using Armstrong's patents without license saw what RCA was doing and fell in line. Rather than settle and pay, they fought. Armstrong was a wealthy man. The RCA stock he had received years before had grown substantially, but legal warfare at this scale was expensive, and it was unending. He spent years in courtrooms. He spent his savings. He mortgaged his future. He was not simply fighting for money, though the royalties owed to him were substantial, running into figures that some estimates place at several $1,000,000. He was fighting for the acknowledgement of what he had done, for the record to show, plainly and legally, that Edwin Howard Armstrong had invented FM radio, and that companies using it owed him that recognition and that compensation. He had spent his life inventing. He had given radio to the world twice over. He was not willing to let this be taken from him. But it was being taken, slowly, methodically, through the machinery of corporate legal power. Friends counseled him to settle. His wife, Marion, watched the man she had married, brilliant, strong, relentless, diminish under the weight of it. The legal bills mounted. In late 1953, Armstrong made a decision that would haunt the historical record forever. He sent Marion away. He told her to leave the apartment they shared. Whether this was to protect her from something he was already planning, or whether it was a symptom of a mind that had fractured under unsustainable pressure, is something no one alive today can say with certainty. What is certain is what happened on the night of January 31st, 1954. Edwin Howard Armstrong, wearing his overcoat and his scarf, opened a window on the 13th floor of his apartment building on East 86th Street in Manhattan and jumped. He was 63 years old. He left a letter to Marion that described his sorrow at the pain he had caused her and expressed his love. He left behind a legal fight that was unresolved, a legacy that was obscured, and an invention that was already, quietly, beginning to conquer the world. Marion Armstrong did not stop fighting when her husband died. She continued the patent litigation in his name, and she won. Over the following decade, she settled with or received judgments against virtually every company that had used Armstrong's FM patents without proper compensation. RCA eventually settled as well. The money came. The legal recognition came, but Edwin was not there to receive it. He never heard the verdict spoken in a courtroom. He never received a check. He never stood before a camera and heard someone say plainly, "You were right, and they were wrong." Sarnoff died in 1971, celebrated as a titan of American industry, the father of broadcasting. His obituaries were largely triumphant. The industry he built was real, and his contributions to it were genuine. But his role in what happened to Armstrong, in the suppression of FM, in the patent disputes, in the regulatory maneuvering, was rarely mentioned in those tributes. History has a way of being kinder to the powerful than to those they destroy. FM radio, in the decades after Armstrong's death, became the dominant form of radio broadcasting in the world. By the 1970s, it had overtaken AM for music broadcasting. By the 1990s, it was simply radio, the default, the standard, the expected. Today, there are tens of thousands of FM stations operating worldwide. Billions of devices receive FM signals. The technology Armstrong built in a Columbia laboratory in the early 1930s, that he proved on a rooftop in New Jersey, that he fought for until the night he had nothing left to fight with, that technology is everywhere, and his name is almost nowhere. Here is what this story is asking you to sit with. It is not simply a story about a bad man defeating a good one. David Sarnoff was not a cartoon villain. He was a visionary in his own right, a man who had also clawed his way up from nothing, who had also built something extraordinary. The system that destroyed Edwin Armstrong was not one person's cruelty. It was the logic of institutional power applied against individual genius. RCA was protecting its investment the way institutions do. The FCC was navigating competing interests the way regulators do. The law was being used as a weapon of delay, the way law can be used. None of it required anyone to twirl a mustache. It only required that money and scale and patience be on one side, and that Edwin Armstrong, for all his brilliance, be alone on the other. And that is the lesson that sits at the heart of this story, and of so many stories like it. Invention is an act of individual vision, but the world that receives an invention, the world that profits from it, regulates it, manufactures it, distributes it, that world belongs to institutions. And when an individual and an institution come into conflict, the institution does not have to be evil to win. It only has to be larger and willing to wait. Armstrong was not the first genius to lose that fight. He was not the last. He is part of a lineage of inventors who built the scaffolding of modern life and were then quietly removed from it, their names replaced by the names of companies, their contributions absorbed into the infrastructure of an industry that no longer needed to admit where it came from. What we owe these people is not pity. Armstrong himself would not have wanted pity. What we owe them is the refusal to forget, the insistence that the name on the patent should be spoken aloud, that when someone asks who invented FM radio, who actually, sitting alone in a laboratory, figured it out, the answer should be Edwin Howard Armstrong, not RCA, not Sarnoff, not the broadcast industry. One man in a room who understood something about waves and frequency and the nature of static that no one else on Earth had understood before him, and who paid for that understanding with everything he had. He put on his overcoat, he opened the window. The radio still plays. Say his name. If this story made you feel something, anger or grief or recognition, then share it, because the only way these names survive is if someone refuses to let them disappear. And on this channel, that is exactly what we do. Every week, another inventor, another theft, another story that should be common knowledge and somehow isn't. Subscribe and stay with us. Next time, we're going inside the life of a man who built the technology behind every television picture ever broadcast and died before he ever received a dime.